people talk about war, we consider its cost. Imagine a war in which not a single missile has fallen yet, not a single shot has been fired, and not a single mobilization announced, but it's already underway and already cost billions of dollars and thousands of future lives. This is not a metaphor and not an exaggeration. This is the first and most important phase of any modern war, the phase of preparing consent for war. Because no war begins at the moment when a soldier crosses a border. It begins at the moment when millions of people stop asking the question why and start repeating, there was no other way. This is precisely where the most underestimated item of military expenditure appears: propaganda. Not as a poster and not as a slogan, but as an industry, as a system, as a carefully planned investment. States pay for war twice. First, to convince, then to shoot. And if the first part works, the second becomes a technical matter. Let's take a concrete example. The Russian state systematically invested money for many years in creating an alternative reality for its own population. According to open data, only the official financing of state media and information policy structures amounted to billions of dollars per year, even before the full-scale aggression against Ukraine. After the war began, these expenses were increased, while a significant portion of costs were hidden in classified budget items related to security, digital sovereignty, and countering extremism. These are not television studios in a vacuum. These are tens of thousands of employees, producers, editors, scriptwriters, political technologists, SMM departments, comment factories, bot farms, and pseudo-analytical centers. This is round-the-clock production of meanings, formulas, and justifications, adapted for different audiences, from pensioners to students, from the provinces to megacities. The price of this work is measured not only in budget lines, it's measured by the fact that by the time the full-scale war began, a significant part of society was already ready to accept practically any scenario. The formulas, we were forced, we are defending ourselves. There was no alternative. This is not a war, but an operation did not arise spontaneously. They were embedded in language for years until they became automatic. And in this sense, Russian propaganda worked efficiently and cold-bloodedly. It didn't convince everyone. It was enough to convince the majority that understanding wasn't necessary, that politics is complicated, that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that it's better not to interfere. This apathy is one of the most valuable products of propaganda because society's silence dramatically reduces the cost of political decisions for those in power. And then the real cost of war begins to grow. Hundreds of billions of dollars in direct military expenditures, a destroyed economy, sanctions, collapse of investments, lost markets, outflow of millions of people, including specialists, doctors, engineers, scientists, a demographic hole whose consequences will be felt for decades. And of course, human lives. Soldiers, civilians, destroyed families, traumatized generations. But by the time all this becomes obvious, the mechanism is already launched. Because propaganda has already prepared society for the idea that a high price is normal, that great goals require sacrifices, that suffering is temporary, that responsibility always lies with the external enemy. This is the moment where information war directly converts into physical war. Each repeated narrative reduces internal resistance to violence. Each day when society doesn't ask questions, makes the next step by authorities cheaper. Mobilization becomes manageable. Losses abstract. Repression justified. And here it's important to say directly, the Russian case is not unique. It's just illustrative. The same mechanisms work in other countries, in other conflicts, under other flags and slogans. The difference is only in packaging. Somewhere, propaganda appeals to greatness and the past. Somewhere, to values and security. Somewhere, to humanitarian considerations. But the essence is always the same: to reduce for society the cost of consent to war. Particularly dangerous is the moment when propaganda extends beyond the internal audience. Russian narratives about the complexity of the conflict, the guilt of all sides, Western provocations have been promoted for years to international audiences, through foreign media, marginal political movements, bloggers, alternative platforms, and social networks. The goal was simple and cynical, not necessarily to convince, just to confuse. Because doubt and fatigue beyond the combat zone also have a price. Every month of delayed decisions, every aid package that wasn't adopted on time, every politician who preferred dialogue instead of action, all this translates into additional destruction and deaths on the ground. This is rarely counted, but it's also the cost of war, and it's paid not only with money but with time. Time that victims of aggression don't have. Therefore, when we talk about war, it's not enough to talk about fronts and armaments. We need to talk about how much it costs to prepare consciousness, how much lies stretched over years cost, how much the habit of not thinking and not asking costs. Because if people were honestly told from the very beginning exactly what war would cost them, in money, in standard of living, in their children's future, most wars simply wouldn't receive public approval. And this is precisely why the first strike is always delivered not to territory, but to thinking. Propaganda is the cheapest and most effective way to start a war because it shifts its cost from initiators to society. And if it seems to you that war is somewhere far away and that you're not participating in it, ask yourself a simple question. What words do you repeat when you hear about war, and how many lives have these words already cost? Because the cost of war is not only what's visible in the frame, it's what becomes normal in the head. This is where everything else begins. And now it's important to record one thing. If you think propaganda is when they lie to you, you've already missed the main point. Modern propaganda almost never lies directly. It does something else. It changes your way of thinking, slowly, almost imperceptibly, so that at some point you begin to consider your reactions natural and your thoughts your own. Any war of the 21st century begins not with shots. It begins with work on consciousness. This is not a figure of speech. This is military doctrine. In 2013, Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov, directly stated that non-military methods of influence are becoming more important than weapons. This was not hidden. This was announced. It's just that no one wanted to hear that war would be waged not only on cities, but on minds. And when the war began, it turned out that many were already in it long before the first missiles. Because the very first strike is always delivered to perception. First, they show you war often, very often. Footage, numbers, commentary, then more, then more. And at some point you catch yourself watching it as background. Not because you don't care, but because the brain is tired. It can't feel pain endlessly. And at this moment, a turning point occurs. You no longer react to the fact of death itself. You only react to the presentation. The tone, format, people talking about it may irritate you, but not the war itself. This is the first stage of zombification. Not consent, but dulling, when war ceases to be an event and becomes noise. And then words enter the game. Because a person thinks in words. And if you replace the words, you can replace the thinking. Then war gradually disappears and turns into conflict. Invasion becomes escalation, murder, losses, destroyed city, difficult situation. You hear these formulations in the news and interviews and conversations. You start using them yourself. Not because you're bad, but because it's more convenient. Less pain, less tension. But along with this, responsibility disappears, because no one is specifically responsible for a conflict. But for war, yes. The next step is even subtler. They start telling you that everything is not so clear-cut, that each side has its own truth, that the world is more complex than it seems. This sounds smart. People who want to be rational like this. But it's precisely this formula that breaks the main internal compass. Because in war, not everything is complex. War always begins with a specific decision by specific people. And when you stop distinguishing this, you stop resisting. You start analyzing instead of evaluating, discussing instead of demanding. This is precisely why endless conversations about causes, context, and historical prerequisites are so beneficial to war. While you're figuring out the complex picture of the world, missiles continue to fly. Then another shift manifests in your consciousness. When you start getting tired not of war, but of conversations about it. News irritates you, activists anger you, people who can't calm down exhaust you. And this is a very important moment, because here war is no longer the enemy. The enemy is the reminder of it. The brain wants peace. It wants to return to normalcy. And if it needs to stop reacting for this, it stops. This is not cowardice. This is a survival mechanism. But it's precisely this mechanism that makes a person an ideal object of control. Because war doesn't need you to support it. It's enough for you to turn away from it. For you to say, I don't decide anything. Let politicians figure it out. I have my own life. These thoughts seem logical, but in reality they mean one thing. You exit the process. And war, no, it continues. And here we come to the most unpleasant part. All this is not accidental. This is not people got tired themselves. This is not society burned out. This is the result of targeted impact on people's minds. This is technology. Its mechanisms are studied, tested, and implemented. Psychologists, behavioral model specialists, military analysts, all know how attention, fatigue, language, emotions work. The difference is only in the goal. In advertising, they sell you a product. In politics, a decision. In war, your silence. Because silence reduces the cost of war. After all, war is always calculation. While society is outraged, it's expensive. Society is tired, it gets cheaper. When people stop distinguishing who attacked and who is defending, it simply becomes background. And here it's important to try to realize, if you've caught yourself thinking that you're tired of hearing about war, if you've said or thought, I don't want to figure this out anymore, if you've felt irritation toward those who continue to call things by their names, it means you're already inside this process. You're already at war, even if physically you're far from the front, because your brain is the battlefield, and it's precisely there that it's now being decided how much longer this war will continue. Not by one decision, not by one vote, but by millions of small internal capitulations. War senses them. It reacts to them. While resistance is below the threshold, it moves forward. While the cost remains acceptable, it continues. And if you think nothing depends on you, ask yourself an honest question. Why then is so much effort spent on making you tired, confused, and silent? The answer is simple. Because you matter. Because without you, war would be too expensive. And this is precisely why they do this to you. They shout about war. We count its cost. You're already at war, even if you think you're not. Everything we've talked about was preparation, warm-up, a test of your reaction. Now fixed reality begins. War doesn't ask for consent. It measures tolerance. Every word, every glance, every distraction of attention, this is a resource it manages. You think the decision not to interfere or not to react is a choice? No. This is entry into a system where the cost of war for the aggressor decreases exactly as much as you've allowed yourself to get tired, distracted, silent. Every society, every country, every city, and every street becomes a battlefield because war knows how to work at all levels simultaneously. The USA, Europe, the Middle East, the Global South. This is not just geography. These are spaces where people's attention and fatigue are measured as resources. You think you're far away, that this is not your problem? Every time you think not everything is so clear-cut, I can't change this. Let politicians decide. You're already inside the system. You're part of the mechanism that makes war cheaper and more effective. And this is not a metaphor. This is measurable. You didn't notice how the words war, murder, aggression disappeared, how they became conflict, losses, operation. You didn't notice how your brain dulled, how fatigue turned into automatic defense, how irritation from news became your reaction instead of pain. Every such signal is recorded by the system, and every time the cost of war falls, war senses this as precisely as a soldier senses an opponent's weakness. And now what's important, there should be no illusions. War doesn't stop on its own. It doesn't await your consent and doesn't ask for moral assessment. It goes on exactly as long as society is ready to endure. And every thought of yours, "I don't care," every phrase, "I'm tired of it," every attempt to be silent is a resource it uses. And if you see this now, this is a chance to realize that war is already inside you, that you're not an observer, but a participant. And if you do nothing, if you continue to think that this is not your war, the cost of continuation for the aggressor will be low. If you realize this, if you begin to see how thoughts and reactions are formed that make you manageable, you'll at least be able to record the fact, understand where the pressure is, what signals, what's really happening in your consciousness. And it's precisely in this moment that the point of your strength lies. Not the illusion of victory, not moral elation, not emotions, just understanding. And when you understand this, everything changes. Because now war encounters resistance not only at the front, but inside you, in your words, your reactions, your attention. Every conscious word, every fixation of fact, every thought, "This is influencing me," is a unit of resistance. The system doesn't tolerate errors, but it also can't completely break what is aware. You are part of the battlefield. You see the technologies of control, you see how they're used. And from this moment, you have a choice to be an object or an observer, consciously or unconsciously. And every second without awareness is a cost that others pay. War measures this cost by millions of small actions and inactions. And now it's important to understand that nothing is finished while this count continues. You're already at war, even if you think you're not. And this is not a question of a distant front. This is a question of your consciousness, your thoughts, your ability to record reality. The system counts every reaction of yours. It records every fatigue, every signal of indifference. And while you realize this, while you see how they're pressuring you, while you understand what exactly they're trying to make of you manageable, you're in the only point of control that's really available. In your attention, in your perception, in your decision to notice and distinguish. And it's precisely here, in this awareness, that you can at least track the cost that continues to be paid at the front and beyond it. And this is already not little, because the cost of war is not only destroyed cities, it's not only casualty statistics, it's millions of small internal capitulations that make it cheap for the aggressor. And if you see this, it means you're beginning to count it properly, and you're already in the count. Here it's important to pause. Not for emotions, for recording. This channel is not about news and not about positions. We don't argue and don't convince, because conviction is also a tool of war. We do only one thing. We slow down the process and count the cost. Not in abstractions, but in decisions, formulations, fatigue, in those thoughts that imperceptibly become the norm. If you've watched up to this point, it means something has already happened. It didn't become easier, but clearer. And this is normal. Awareness doesn't console, it deprives of protection. This is precisely why it's dangerous for any system built on manipulation. War doesn't need your fear and doesn't need your hatred. It needs your automaticity, when you stop asking questions and accept reality in ready-made form. This channel exists so that this automatism breaks, not in mass and not immediately, but in each individual person who begins to notice where their reaction ceases to be their own. We don't offer solutions and recipes. We show the process, because as soon as the process becomes visible, it ceases to be absolute. You may disagree, you may close the video, you may get angry, but you can no longer say you didn't know. And this is the only point where a person retains real choice, not between for and against, but between awareness and automatism. War wins not when they shoot, it wins when they stop thinking. They shout about war, we count its cost, and this count continues.